It is a place in which words cannot begin to describe the eternal, everlasting torment of the place. It is a place that if you have the slightest inkling of the reality of this place, you would not wish upon your worst, most bitter enemy to go there for even 20 seconds. That's the place that Jesus is speaking of. We've seen that our world is filled with this same type of thing in which the non-believing world says, let us figure out ways to capitalize on sinfulness. Let us figure out ways to entrap people further into sin. And Jesus' point is, your Father knows this. Your Father has not taken His eye off of you. And those who entrap my people into sin, woe to them. Their state, their condition would be improved with a millstone around their neck cast into the sea, because at least then their guilt would stop. They would stop entrapping more people into sinfulness. So this must have been comforting and encouraging to the disciples to hear. But notice how Jesus now shifts gears. He goes now from how are we to think about those who entrap us into sin or others who would entrap other people into sin. He goes from that to how are we to think about entrapping ourselves into sin. Notice his progression here, now from verse 43. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. For it is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. For it is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So now Jesus shifts gears from how are we to think about others who cause us to sin or the sinful occasions that the world presents to us. Now he shifts to how are we to think about the sinful occasions that we present to ourselves? How are we to think through this? So Jesus now turns in this teaching, he turns to the subject of hell. You know, in generations past, I remember from when I was a kid, hell was a rather common topic for preachers to visit, wasn't it? I remember as a child, the church that I grew up in as a child is probably once a month or once every 2 months that you would hear a sermon that was a sermon about hell. We called it hell and brimfire preaching. Now, there were some positive aspects to that and there were some negative aspects to that, but I'm just simply observing now that that has completely passed off the scene, has it not? It is completely out of vogue for preachers to address the topic of hell. But we're going to do that this morning, and the reason we're going to do that is because Jesus does that. Jesus, by the way, speaks of hell far more than he speaks of heaven. In fact, if it were not for the words of Jesus, do you realize we would know almost nothing about hell if it weren't for the teachings of Jesus? When we think about our Old Testaments, we recognize the fact that the Old Testament refers to the reality of hell exceedingly rarely. Only 2 instances, we'll look at those in just a moment, only 2 instances in the Old Testament in which the Old Testament refers to the reality of hell. We turn to the book of, for example, the book of the Revelation, and we find that the reality of hell is abundant in Revelation. It's not called hell, it's called the lake of fire, some 6 or 7 times in the book of Revelation. Same concept though. But outside the book of the Revelation, we find hell 14 times in all the New Testament. Of those 14 times, Peter mentions it once, James mentions it once, 12 times at the lips of Jesus. So 12 out of 14 times that hell is mentioned in the New Testament outside of the lake of fire in Revelation, it comes to us from the words of Jesus. So Jesus often visited this topic of hell. He often spoke of the reality of hell. So what was he speaking of? Well, the word that is used here is the word Gehenna. The Anglicanized or the English version of that would be what we would refer to as Gehenna. So what was Gehenna, or what is Gehenna, or Gehenna? Gehenna was or is a steep ravine located just outside of Jerusalem, just to the northwest of Jerusalem. and it proceeds down to the southwest of Jerusalem and runs into the Kidron Valley. It's a steep embankment, a steep ravine that has a history to it. Way back in the days of King Ahaz was one of the wicked kings of Judah. Israel had fallen into sin. Judah and Israel both had fallen deeply into sin, but Ahaz, under the leadership of Ahaz, Judah fell into the most disgraceful, the most blasphemous, the most hideous sin of all, which was the sin of child sacrifice, of blood child sacrifice. As the Israelites began copying their pagan neighbors and offering blood sacrifices of their own children to the pagan god Moloch. Now that was done at a specific place, and you can see where I'm going with this. That was done in Gehenna. Gehenna or Gehenna was the place, the cultic ritual holy place of child sacrifice in ancient Israel. So this practice of child sacrifice was loudly decried by Jeremiah, by Isaiah, but it wasn't brought to an end until King Josiah took the throne. King Josiah put an end to child sacrifice. It took a Wilkerson to end all this. But King Josiah finally put all this to end, once and for all, the practice of child sacrifice. But King Josiah, in his wisdom, did not just want to stop the sacrifice. He wanted to make sure it stayed stopped. He didn't want to just pause it. So you know how he went about that? He went about making sure that it didn't reoccur by defiling the holy place where it was done. Common practice in the ancient world, if you wanted to stop a certain type of ritualistic worship, then what you did was you defiled the place in which that worship took place. That's what went on in Jerusalem in AD 70 when the Romans offered the pig sacrifice in the temple. It was their way of ending that. Or as Jesus will speak about the abomination that leads into desolation or different things. We understand the concept. There's a holy place. There's a ritual place of a certain religion. If you want to end that, if you want to undermine that permanently, you defile their place of worship. So King Josiah said, I'm going to stop this and stop it for good by defiling the place where this is done, by turning it into a garbage heap. Tens of thousands of people lived in Jerusalem. Those people produce a lot of garbage. Something needs to be done with the garbage. There's no landfill nearby. So he makes a landfill at this place called Gehenna. And so the people, the tens of thousands of Jerusalem residents, would dump their garbage here in this ravine. And so this garbage was burned. And so it was constantly a fire burning. So now you're starting, I think, to see some of the things behind Jesus' image of the unquenchable fire. Because there was always the fire going. Day and night, they burned this garbage, and it was never burned up, because as soon as it was about to be burned up, there comes more people dumping more garbage onto it. So constantly burning, constantly the stench of not just garbage. You've been to the landfill, you know that smell of the landfill. Not just the stench of garbage, but the stench of burning garbage. In addition to that, this is where all the animal carcasses were thrown. In addition to that, not just animal carcasses, but the carcasses, or the corpses, I should say, of criminals who were executed. They were dumped here. So the animal carcasses were dumped here, and you can imagine just how many animal carcasses that was. Not just the animal carcasses that were produced naturally from an ancient agrarian society that did everything by animals, but imagine the sacrifices. Not to be too graphic here, but those sacrifices have leftovers. And what's to be done with the thousands and thousands and thousands of leftovers? They need to be dumped somewhere. And what happens when you dump animal flesh, when you dump organic flesh? Worms. And those worms had an unceasing supply of food because there was constantly more carcasses being dumped. So now Jesus' imagery is starting to become more complete. The place of unquenchable fire, the fire that never stops, and the worm that never dies. Or to put it another way, the worm that is forever sustained never runs out of food because they never run out of carcasses to devour. So this place, Gehenna. And this place, Gehenna, began to become the metaphorical reference to eternal torment. The metaphorical, it stood as a symbol, it stood as a reference to this eternal place of hell. And so that's why Jesus, every time Jesus refers to the place, He refers to it by the word Gehenna, or as we would say, Gehenna. So this is what Jesus is getting at when He speaks of the unquenchable fire that never is put out, the worm that never dies, this place of unrelenting, unending torment. So this subject of hell, as we said earlier, is a subject that's sort of passed out of favor. It's sort of even almost taboo today to speak of hell, because we find it, quite frankly, a reality that's difficult to deal with, because it seems to fly in the face of, listen carefully to this, fly in the face of how we want to think about God. Because we want to think about a God who's loving and compassionate and caring and forgiving, and a God who is so skewed or perhaps exclusively love and forgiveness and care and compassion. For that God to have a place of eternal torment just doesn't seem to mesh. Because the thing about God that we choke on most today in the modern church is this, the holiness of God. That is what we choke on most today in the modern church, is the holiness of God. We usually have no problem thinking of a God of love and forgiveness and compassion, but when it comes to justice and holiness, those can become difficult concepts for us, and the reality of hell requires a holy God. And you can say the same thing in reverse. A holy God requires an eternal hell. Both of those realities require one another. And so it becomes a subject that is not quite, well, she would say, not our favorite subject to talk about, but it was one of Jesus's. So as Jesus is speaking of this place of torment, one of the things that's a sort of a modern invention is this idea of annihilationism, in which some have proposed that those who die outside of Christ don't go to a place of eternal torment. They just cease to exist, because that's much more palatable to think of those who rebelled against the living God, defied the living God, refused to bow and worship the living God, just stopping their existence at the point of death. Never mind the fact that that means that they got away with their rebellion. But that just seems to be much more palatable to us today. And so that's an idea that's quickly catching on. More and more people are subscribing to that. Never mind the fact that it has absolutely zero biblical support. Instead, there's just the opposite. A place of eternal torment is what the Scriptures support. So where does Jesus get His teaching of a place of eternal torment, of everlasting torment? Well, there are two references in the Old Testament to this place. Both of them also reference the eternality of the place. For example, Isaiah 66 and verse 24. This is the final verse in Isaiah's prophecy, the final verse. It is quoted nearly verbatim in our passage today. And they shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against me, for their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be in abhorrence of all flesh. So you hear there not only the torment of the place, but you hear of the eternality of the place, the everlasting nature of the place. Also in Daniel 12 and verse 2, this is the other Old Testament reference. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. You hear the everlasting repeated twice there. So Jesus preached, He taught about a place of torment reserved for the devil and his angels and all those who follow them. And this is a place of everlasting torment. Jesus would refer to it in Matthew 25, verse 41, when He says, "Then He will say to those on the left, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire.'" Or John the Baptizer in Matthew 3 and verse 12, speaking of Jesus, will say, "His winnowing fork is in His hand, and He will clear His threshing floor and gather His wheat into the barn. But the chaff," or the rebels, the unrepentant, the unbelieving ones, the chaff, He will burn with unquenchable fire. Unquenchable fire. Never able to be quenched. In addition to the eternality or the everlasting nature of this, Jesus also taught about a place that was not only everlasting, but was intense in its torment. He would speak in Luke 16 and verse 24 of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And in that parable, we of course remember the rich man's words as he says, "Could Abraham just dip a finger in water and touch my tongue? For that is the degree of torment in which I find myself. Just a finger dipped in water touching me would bring me such relief." Or he speaks in Matthew 8 and verse 12 of a similar thing, outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Look with me in Revelation 14, verses 10 and 11. We read the fuller passage before the service began. "He also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured forth full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name." Here we see the eternality of the punishment. We see the intensity of the punishment described as the smoke of their torment going up day and night with no rest. Places of outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth. The Revelation describes it as a lake of fire. So we often ask the question, does this mean that hell is a place of literal fire? Is it literally a lake of fire? And I don't know the answer to that, though I suspect the answer is no. I suspect it's not a literal place of fire. But here's the thing to understand well. When we speak about biblical symbolism, biblical metaphors and biblical symbolism, shadows that point to the greater reality, in every case of biblical symbolism, every single one, the reality that the symbolism points to is more intense than the symbol that points to it. There's not a single exception to that. Every time symbolic language is used in the Scripture, the reality that it points to is worse or more intense, or if it's a godly reality, better. In whatever case, it's more intense than the symbol itself. R.C. Sproul, when he preaches this passage, he says that if we could go to hell, to this lake of fire, and offer those who are there to go from where they are to a literal lake of fire, that they would jump at the opportunity, because that would be a great improvement to where they are. So whether this is a literal place of flames or not, the imagery is clear. It's a place of great, great eternal torment. We have this image, I think, of hell that I was taught as a kid. I sort of grew up in a church environment in which this image of hell, remember I said it was preached on once every month or every other month. But this image of hell was this place that I was taught, in which is full of people who have been condemned to hell, and they spend eternity saying to themselves, if I just had one more chance, if I just had one more chance, I would repent, I would believe, I'd get out of this place. That's not biblical at all. That's not a biblical picture of hell at all. Instead, hell is described as a place of great gnashing of teeth. That means anger. Paul Washer puts it this way. He said, if God were to go to hell and stand in the doorway and say to those souls who are there, acknowledge me and leave this place, they would slam the door in his face and say, we hate you now more than ever. It's a place of never-ending anger, never resolving bitterness, hatred, like nothing that this life can describe. Torment, like nothing on earth can describe. One of the ways in which we misspeak as Christians is I've said this, probably everyone in the room has said this, if you've ever used a phrase in such a way as to say, blank is hell. This root canal is hell. Oh, this class that I'm going through is just hell. with all due respect, if you say that and believe it, you don't have a clue of what hell is. It is a place in which words cannot begin to describe the eternal, everlasting torment of the place. It is a place that if you have the slightest inkling of the reality of this place, you would not wish upon your worst, most bitter enemy to go there for even 20 seconds. That's the place that Jesus is speaking of. And notice with me who He speaks it to. He's not talking to Pharisees. He's talking to His people. And He threatens, if you will, His own people to say to them, your battle against sin is so important that in order to communicate to you the seriousness of this battle, I will threaten you with eternal damnation, with eternal hell. Again, what happened to our polite, kind, loving, caring Jesus, who never said harsh things, who was always just full of love, and that's all He ever was? What happened to that Jesus? Answer, He never existed. Because the Jesus of the Gospels would use the most harsh words, the most harsh realities, to warn His people that if their battle against sin faltered, this is what they should fear.